Welcome to the Speak Her podcast with your host, Camille Essick, the podcast where creators and innovators connect. Let's get started.
Hey everybody, welcome back. This is Camille Essick. I am host of the Speaker Podcast, the podcast where innovators and creators connect. Now, before we get into this conversation, what I need you to do right now is hit that notification bell and subscribe. I'm streaming across various platforms such as iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Pandora. And of course, I have to let you know that the Speaker Podcast, we have a soundtrack that is available on Tidal and my YouTube channel. But if you're on the go, definitely check it out on my Tidal channel there. And you can go to my website and grab that at CamilleEssick.com. Just tune in and subscribe. Subscription is free. Lots of great things are coming up. And I cannot wait. So if you're following me on Instagram as well as the Speaker Podcast on Facebook, those are great places to stay in the loop. And if you're a subscriber, of course, my subscribers get the notification first. So we're going to hop into it. First of all, I want to shout out my sponsor for this episode, which is InStep. Shout out to Reese and Stanley Ponder. They've been a sponsor of the Speaker Podcast. So, it's no problem shouting them out. So, I do want to make the disclaimer, as I did in the previous episode, I'm not a licensed therapist, psychologist, psychotherapist, counselor. However, these are just conversations I feel that we need to sit down and talk and chat about. So if you've been tuning in, the Speaker Podcast, I think tomorrow is, today is Friday. So I don't know when you're listening to this, but we're going into spring, like spring is here. And I really wanted to have a series as the weather begins to warm up outside of the Speaker Podcast, because Heart and Souls for the brothers, but within the podcast, I should say, correcting myself, we needed something for the ladies. And so this series is a multi-episode series. It's called The Psychology of You. And we're really talking about and discussing the formation and the foundation of self-esteem among Black women within our community. Of course, we're not a monolith. This is not blanket, but these are just some general points. Now, if you haven't done so, please grab your smart device, whatever you use to take notes with. Me, personally, I'm old school. There's nothing like, pen and paper. If you have a prayer journal or personal journal, grab that as well, and let's just hop in. So if you've been walking with me through this series, then you already know we've been taking our time. We're not rushing. We're not performing. We're not skimming the surface. We've been asking deeper questions about self-esteem of Black women, where it begins, how it's shaped, what distorts it, what protects it, and what it takes to rebuild it. So just to recap a few things, in episode 1, we talked about the foundation, those early messages, the lack of affirmation, the adultification of Black girls, the difference between survival and identity. And stuff. So that was what we covered in episode 1. So then in episode 2, we talked about trauma and survival, how it can be used, like a strength that can stop the feeling like a gift and how start feeling more like an assignment, because survival patterns can become more of a personality if they're not really examined. And then in episode 3, we talked about community and comparison, how belonging shapes us, right? How community can hold us, but also expose our insecurities. Also, we chatted about how comparison is not always loud, but often is quiet, internal, and it can be very exhausting. So now today we're stepping into one of the deepest spaces of all, faith, the Black church, and identity. Because, for many of us, church was not just somewhere we went. It was a world. It was a language. It was a rhythm. It was structure, family. It was moral formation. It was spiritual covering. It was community. It was belonging. It was guidance. It was hope. For many Black women, the church not only shaped what we believed about God, but also what we believed about ourselves. Because if a place helps shape your identity, then it can also shape your self-esteem as well. And sometimes in beautiful ways, sometimes in painful ways, and sometimes both can be true at the same time. So today I want us to talk honestly, not carelessly, not, critically for the sake of being critical, and definitely not from a place of disrespect because I'm third generation PK, so we're not doing that. But because if we cannot be honest about our spiritual places and how they shaped us, then we cannot fully understand ourselves. And if we cannot understand ourselves, we cannot heal with clarity. This episode is not about attacking the church. And I want to say that again for the people in the back. This episode is definitely not about attacking the church. It's about asking harder questions inside the spaces that shaped us. Because some of us learned how to pray before we learned how to process. And some of us learned how to serve before we learned how to self respect and self reflect. Some of us learned how to be faithful before we learned how to be emotionally honest. And over time, those things start to affect identity in ways we may not even realize. So the question is not just, what did I believe? The question is also, who did I become in order to belong in spaces that taught me how to believe? So if you're taking notes, this is the first point as we get deeper into this conversation. For many of us, church was the first mirror. What does that mean? Let's break that down. So many Black women, the Black church was one of the first mirrors we had. It reflected us, or I should say, it reflected back to us what was good, what was acceptable, what was honorable, what was shameful, what was holy, what was out of order, what womanhood should look like, what femininity should sound like, what faithfulness should require. How does faithfulness look? How does consistency look? And that mirror had power because when you're young, you don't always separate God from people, faith from culture, or spiritual truth from community expectation. You just like absorb. You absorb what gets praised. You absorb what gets corrected. You absorb what gets named as rebellion. You absorb what is called as humility. Also, what gets celebrated as virtue. And you also absorb what gets interpreted as too much. So if you were told you were gifted, you carried that. If you were told that you were called, you carried that. If you told you were strong, you carried that. If you were told to be careful, to be modest, to be respectful, to be submitted, to be patient, to be disciplined, to be prayerful, you carried those things too. And again, some of that was beautiful. Some of it gave structure, safety, moral grounding, and some of it gave language to suffering. Some of it gave hope in hard times. But some of it also formed us in ways that we were deeply aware of, performance. Because when spiritual spaces become one of your mirrors, you begin learning very early that you're not just being seen, you're being interpreted. And when you're being interpreted, you start learning how to manage what people see. Point 2. When holiness and performance get too close to each other. Whoa, Cam, like that sounds major. I know it does. So we're going to take our time with this. And this is where I want to slow down. Because one of the hardest things to untangle in faith communities is the distance between true spiritual formation and emotional or social performance. Now, why is that? Because sometimes those things get too close together and that can become difficult, being able to decipher or tell the difference. You can learn how to sound spiritually mature, how to quote the right things, how to show up faithfully, how to serve consistently, how to look together, how to be agreeable, how to appear disciplined, how to carry pain quietly and call it grace. And to the outside world, it can look like wholeness. It can look like deep wholeness. But inside, You may still be wrestling, hurting, confused, lonely, exhausted, ashamed, uncertain, still feeling unseen. And one of those quiet dangers in the church spaces is that sometimes being spiritually articulate can hide emotional neglect. Let that sit for a moment. How you know how to say the right things, right? You know how to encourage other people. You know how to pray over pain. You know how to show up. You know how to keep moving. You know how to grieve on the go. But do you know how to tell when the truth about where you actually are? I'll say that again. Do you know how to tell the truth about where you actually are? And that's a different question because we're not always honest. We're not always truthful about where we actually are. Because for some Black women, faith spaces taught us that being good, no matter so much that we never learned how to be honest. So it's not dishonest with other people necessarily, but it's actually being disconnected from ourselves. You learn how to override your emotions. You learn how to suppress certain questions. You learn how to present peace before you have actually processed pain or grief. You learn how to keep serving while quietly you feel empty. You learn how to call survival strength, burnout sacrifice, and emotional silence maturity. And after a while, you can lose touch with the difference between genuine peace and practice composure. Now, that's not judgment. That's a reality for a lot of women because if the environment rewards appearance more than honesty, people learn how to survive through appearance. Point three, the Black church has often given Black women language for strength, but not always space for softness. Let's sit here with this just for a moment. Now, hear me out. The Black church has historically been a place of endurance and survival and resistance. It held together our communities through oppression and grief and poverty and violence and transition. The church for us has been a place of refuge and leadership, stability, and it's been a witness, and it still is. That's the matter. And that's what, let me say that again. That's what really matters. And that should be honored. Why? Because it has been a survival centered institution. It's often taught Black women and given us language for endurance more than language for softness. You know, there's language for strength, there's language for faithfulness, for perseverance, for service, for sacrifice. It's also given language for covering others and long suffering, but not always language for tenderness, not always language for emotional permission or rest, not always the language for being held, not always language for setting boundaries, not always language for saying, I'm not okay. So what happens? A lot of Black women become deeply spiritually competent, but emotionally undertended. You know how to intercede. You know how to identify, but do you know how to identify your own unmet needs? Like, do you know how to pinpoint those areas that are lacking? You know how to discern for other people, but do you know how to sit with your own grief? You know how to keep showing up for others, but do you know how to stop when your soul is tired? You know how to be dependable, but do you know how to receive care without feeling guilty? These are not small questions, not by a long shot. Because if all of your spiritual language is built around enduring, carrying, pressing, covering, fighting, surviving, then softness can feel like, you know, spiritually suspicious. Rest can feel lazy. Boundaries can feel selfish. Emotional honesty can feel like weakness. Confusion can feel like failure. Needing support can feel like a lack of faith. And that does something to self esteem, right? Because now your sense of goodness is not just tied to your heart, but to your ability to remain composed, useful, available, spiritually impressive under pressure. Point four, being, how can I say this? Being chosen, it comes with its own kind of pressure. And I think we're going to make this point number four. Now, I want to talk to you about something tender. Now, for many women in church spaces, there is language around being chosen. It's called, anointed, set apart, marked, different, gifted. And that language can be affirming. It can help someone understand that their life has meaning, that their existence is not random, that God sees them, that their story matters. But if we're not careful, that same language can become pressure. Because if being chosen gets interpreted only through responsibility, then womanhood can feel like assignment without permission to be human. Now everything becomes weighty, like it's heavy. You're not just living, you're carrying purpose. You're not just tired, you are in warfare. You're not just grieving, you're being stretched. You're not just overwhelmed, you're being developed. And while there's some truth in spiritual framing, sometimes spiritual language gets used too quickly and emotional reality gets skipped over. Sometimes a woman does not just need to be reminded that she's called. Sometimes we need, and I'm saying this in first person, we need room to say, I'm tired, I'm disappointed, I feel unseen, I'm angry, I do not understand, I need help. I do not have the language for this season and what it's doing to me. If every struggle gets immediately spiritualized, then people may never feel safe enough to tell the truth about the emotional and psychological reality of what they're carrying. Now, over time, being chosen can stop feeling affirming and can start feeling isolating because now you believe that your pain must always be interpreted through purpose, and that can make it harder to admit when you really need care. Point five, modesty, submission, and policing of Black womanhood. This part needs to be tacked, but it also needs to be honest. Now, for many of us, the church did not shape spirituality. It also shaped gender expression. Now, of course, I'm going to tread lightly here, but we need to have this conversation. Body awareness, voice, presence, desirability, and what it meant to be a good woman. We've all heard about hashtag P31. If you know, you know. You learn early what is considered to be modest, what is considered to be out of order, what's considered to be loud, too visible, too opinionated, too emotional, too sensual, you Jezebel, too assertive, too independent, too ambitious, too difficult. And again, some of this comes from sincere efforts to guide, protect, and discipline. But some of it also comes from over policing, especially for Black girls and Black women whose bodies and voices are often already misled in a broader society. So now there's double pressure. The world may already project onto you, and the church may ask you to manage those projections carefully so that you're not misunderstood. That can make you hyper aware of yourself, hyper aware of your body, hyper aware of your tone, hyper aware of your femininity, hyper aware of your confidence, and how that will be interpreted. Also, hyper aware of whether your presence feels threatening, distracting, rebellious, or out of place. And over time, you may begin confusing holiness with smallness. You may begin believing that goodness requires shrinking, that virtue requires silence, that dignity requires self-erasure. Now, that being covered means becoming less visible because there's a difference between spiritual maturity and disappearance. Now, a lot of women are, they're still trying to figure out whether what they've learned made them grounded or if it made them afraid of themselves. If you're taking notes, we're now on point number 6. When church is a place of healing for some and a place of hiding for others. The church can absolutely be a place of healing. It is. And let me say that clearly. It can be a place where people encounter God deeply, where people are restored, where people are prayed through, where people are seen, where people are discipled, where people are loved, where people are covered, where people are changed. Now that's real. It can be a place where some can learn to hide in plain sight, and that's just the truth. Not because they're fake, because they don't know yet whether the truth of who they are, will it be held in tenderness. So they hide. What's hidden? They hide their depression behind serving, grief behind consistency, exhaustion behind smiling, their confusion behind I'm trusting God, resentment behind politeness, fear behind over spiritual language, unmet needs behind usefulness. And sometimes everybody around them thinks they're doing well because they're functioning well. But functioning well is not always the same thing as being whole. That applies to spirituality and being spiritual as well. Because, just because someone is active doesn't mean that they're healed. Just because someone is gifted doesn't mean they're emotionally safe. Just because someone is faithful does not mean they're internally at peace. And if church spaces do not create room for truth telling, then women will continue to be celebrated for their strength while quietly starving for tenderness. And that is the kind of thing I want the listeners, you, myself, and I want us to sit with that. Not to condemn the church, definitely not doing that, but to ask, what have I learned, when showing up spiritually? Have I learned how to be honest before God and honest with myself? And I want to be transparent in this space for a moment. So, in my prayer time a couple months ago, I was in prayer with God and we were in a moment, right? And I heard God speak to me and pose the question as clearly as I could possibly hear him in that moment. And he asked me, "You're mad at me, aren't you?" And I could feel myself, take that breath like, what? And he was like, you can tell me, I can handle it. I know you're not being disrespectful. I'm not afraid of your humanity. But tell me, you're mad at me because of what I allowed. You're mad at me because I allowed it. And before I could even process the question fully, I remember blurting out yes. And it was like in that moment, something just broke, and God was like, I was waiting on that. I was waiting on you to say that. I was waiting to hear that. And once I was able to admit to God how I was really feeling about some things, that's when the next phase and level of my healing began in that process and journey. And in that prayer moment, something began to break, and I was able to be more open and honest with God. So I want to slow this down and let these questions breathe, right? What did church teach me about womanhood? What did church teach me about being good? What did I learn, honestly, about my emotions? And what did I learn about emotional control or even emotional honesty? Do I feel safe telling the truth in my faith spaces? Have I confused serving with healing? Have I confused discipline with wholeness? Have I confused being needed with being loved? What parts of myself feel safe and welcomed in spiritual spaces? What parts of myself have I learned to hide? And maybe the deepest question of all, did my faith formation help me become more fully myself in God? Or did it teach me to perform the most acceptable version of myself for people? Let that sit for a minute, because that question is not light, but it's necessary. I believe real faith should make you more honest, not less, more whole, not hidden, more free, not more fractured, more grounded, not more performative. Faith should not require you to disappear in order to be accepted. It should not require you to be silent, to silence your humanity in order to prove your spirituality. It should not teach you to fear your own emotional truth. Not saying you have to blast your business all over social media, but there has to be a space where you're able to express those things that you're feeling and where you are right now in this season of life. The goal is not to discard faith. The goal is to purify what we've confused, to separate God from projection, spiritual formation from image management, conviction from shame, wisdom from control, holiness from performance, service from self-erasure. And that kind of reflection takes courage, because some of us are not just willing to heal from life. We're healing from ways we learn to survive inside sacred spaces without always being fully seen. And that's tender work. But it's holy work too. Now, if this episode pressed on you, I want to say this gently. That does not mean your faith is weak. It may simply mean that you're becoming more honest. And honesty is not rebellion. Sometimes honesty is the beginning of healing. Sometimes the most faithful thing you can tell the truth about is how it shaped you, what helped you, what hurt you, what formed you, what silenced you, what sustained you, and what you're still trying to understand. Why is that? Because faith cannot hold truth becomes performance. And I do not believe that is what God desires for his daughters. So in the next episode, we're going to go deeper into the economy, productivity, and worth. Because for a lot of Black women, value has been tied to labor, output, achievement, and how much we can carry. And if we do not examine that honestly, we'll keep calling burnout purpose and overwork discipline. Hope you got something from this episode, and be sure to hit that notification bell and subscribe. And I'll catch you in the next episode. Bye.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Speak Her podcast. Be sure to follow Camille on Instagram at camille.essick, Facebook at the Speak Her podcast, or www.camilleessick.com.
It's the Speak Her podcast. Can we be yours?